Is this jazz? It sounds like jazz. I mean, it doesn't sound like jazz because it's coming out of a Super Nintendo, but if you get past the sound of the hardware, you find all the key elements of jazz. And I don't just mean like, look at all these seventh chords. I'm talking walking bass line, minor blues progression, but with a bunch of altered dominant chords thrown in, and wailing improvised sax solo. That's all stuff that only really belongs in jazz, right? What you're listening to is from a game called Leading Company, a business sim game released in Japan in 1992 and released in the rest of the world never. The goal of the game is to be the most successful VHS machine manufacturing company in Japan, if that phrase even means anything to you Zoomers watching this. The soundtrack is exclusively made up of these astonishingly authentic sounding jazz pieces arranged for just 4 voices on the SNES sound chip, each one featuring at least one improvised solo in between looping statements of the melody. But hold on a sec. Isn't it ridiculous to say that any music that's been programmed into a piece of hardware is improvised? I would have said so, but the way these solos are built, the fluency of the language, the way the lines evolve, the slight rhythmic irregularities, they truly do sound improvised. When I first heard this, I was kind of blown away. Could someone really have programmed out something that sounds so human and so in the moment? And this led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. My friend Dak, who introduced me to the game's soundtrack in the first place, found an arrangement album of the Leading Company soundtrack called Keys of the City, performed by a group of New York jazz musicians. Only it couldn't be an arrangement album of the game's soundtrack because it was released 2 years before the game Leading Company came out. What must have happened is that composer Yoshihisa Tomobechi, who's credited as composer on the arrangement album for almost every tune, commissioned a group of New York studio musicians to record his compositions and improvise solos on them, as jazz musicians are known to do, and then he took those recordings and programmed the band's performances into the Super Nintendo, solos and all. It's really an impressive and groundbreaking way to construct a soundtrack for 1990 especially, and Tomobechi did an excellent job of preserving the energy and nuances of the original improvisations. The track Lewis features a great solo, and all of the little details that make it human stand out so much in the SNES version where you don't expect that kind of human attention to detail. Pay attention to the decisions made on every note. Which notes are staccato and which are full, which notes sit exactly on the beat and which lay a bit behind, the gentle double-time swing of the 16th notes, the quick runs leading into notes that are barely audible as the hardware tries to keep up with the speed of the line. Doesn't it feel as if a person is trapped inside a Super Nintendo and his only way out is to play a sax solo slick enough? The live band version of Lewis was recorded by a trio made up of piano, bass, and drums, but the melody was ported to a sax sample for the game, and the original piano performance was pared down to just 2 channels. The need to cut out a bunch of notes to fit this on the Super Nintendo seems like it would damage the effect of the music quite a bit, but you realize in listening to this comparison that it's mostly the rhythm and the details of the phrasing that carries the humanity of the performance. The hip chord voicings are just the cherry on top. Discovering this experiment made me realize just how much musicality comes from phrasing. The little micro decisions of note length and rhythmic placement don't stand out on the original recording because it's so natural. Like, of course that's how the piano was played. But taken out of its original context, and imagining someone trying to program all of these little details into a Super Nintendo in the 90s makes you realize how sophisticated this playing really is, and how much musicality a player has to have to be able to make these kinds of decisions in the moment. Unfortunately, there were some pretty strict hardware limitations that would make direct translation from Jazz Trio to game soundtrack impossible for most of the pieces. Most SNES games used 8 channels for their soundtracks, whereas, for whatever reason, Leading Company only used 4, which necessitated some compromises. Luckily, Tomobechi was not just an innovative composer, but also a problem solver, and the tracks in the game where he had to deviate from the source recordings to capture the intent of the music gives us some of the best parts of the soundtrack. Lights Across the Bay was originally recorded as a slow, synth-based ballad with electric fretless bass melody singing out underneath warm synth pads. This is followed up by another statement of the melody by a soprano sax, and then we get a great soprano sax solo floating over top of these same pads. There's no real rhythmic presence beside the melody throughout the whole track. It's very floaty and ethereal. This would not have worked well on the Super Nintendo version, not just because of the limited voices, but also because of the sounds available. These thick, dreamy synth pads probably were not possible to recreate on the Super Nintendo hardware, and so the game version replaces them with a bouncy chord accompaniment, oddly placing the bass note on the offbeats for a reverse oompa rhythm. A pa-oom rhythm, if you will. The melodic phrasing is again expertly placed. The bass melody off the top lays back just a hair, with most notes coming in just after the chord stabs that play on the same beat. See if you can hear what I'm talking about. If these two parts were lined up perfectly, it would probably make it harder to hear the melody, and it would definitely sound a lot more robotic, but as it is, this music feels mature. The change in accompaniment also changed the harmony. The general voice leading of the original chord changes is kept, but obviously there were some choices to be made about which notes out of these thick voicings to include on the hardware's limited space. These choices were also stuck over a B-flat bass pedal for most of the piece, which changes the character of the harmony considerably. All of these factors combined make the harmony so much more interesting in the game version. Now the chords revert to something closer to the recorded version for the solo section, as the soloist was reacting to the chord changes in the moment, and so changing them too much underneath the solo would totally change the intent of what the player was trying to play. But the shift also changes the feeling of the arrangement. Instead of feeling like we're going over the same material again, the solo section feels like a fresh development, a new take on the theme that we just established. There's a great moment in the solo too. It starts off with the sax playing very rhythmically free, floating above the beat and then ripping up and down scales, dropping in these little jabs, never giving a strong sense of pulse, but then at the end of this first 8-bar phrase, right when the harmony gives us the secondary dominant D-flat 7 that resolves to our G-flat major 7, The solo breaks into this perfect 16th note bebop line that pushes the music into the stratosphere. Oh, this is the kind of thing you only get from improvised solos, and it's such a fantastic moment. We have the daring and spontaneous spirit of jazz captured here inside a game cartridge. This brings me back to my original question. Is this jazz? Like, not the live version, I mean the video game version. Is this jazz? The music that we place under the jazz umbrella is so varied and covers so much ground that the only real meaningful definition of jazz is music played by jazz musicians who are trying to play jazz. And the original reference recordings that this music is based off of is clearly jazz music. So is this recreated performance also jazz? Or is it something else? Does this iteration of these tunes count as improvised music? There's also a clear contribution of the game hardware to the music too. It's not just like how a recording is different than a live performance. A recording is capturing a live performance. But the jazz recordings and the synthesized recreations are not interchangeable. There's something lost in the transition from players to programming, but there's also something else gained. There's a different atmosphere to the sound of the Super Nintendo. The music has the charm that all SNES music has from that sound, but combined with the preserved humanity of the performances, we get something new. Something possibly greater than the sum of its parts. And this is 1991, way before anyone could have expected Chiptune Jazz to exist in the form that it does now. This reminds me of a few other conceptual albums that tackled similar questions. Kind of Bloop and Blue by Mostly Other People Do the Killing. Kind of Bloop was very similar to Leading Company's soundtrack actually. 6 different chiptune artists were commissioned to recreate seminal jazz album Kind of Blue using the techniques of chiptune music making. Blue by Mostly Other People Do the Killing saw the band re-recording note-for-note covers of the whole Kind of Blue album, even the improvised solos. I suppose Kind of Blue's legacy as the jazz album to know makes it the perfect subject for this kind of conceptual art piece. Improvisation is a big part of the jazz idiom, and while not every great jazz composition or recording features improvisation, the kind of note-for-note cover from Mostly Other People Do the Killing feels completely against the jazz ethos. But that's the whole point, to ask, can a record that sounds exactly like jazz not be jazz? Kind of Bloop asks the reverse question, can this music that sounds nothing like jazz be jazz if the music it's delivering is at its source jazz music? Leading Company's soundtrack explored this same artistic territory almost 20 years earlier, although creating a jazz record from scratch to adapt makes the project less of a commentary on jazz, and more just an extremely innovative way to make a game soundtrack. You're also much less likely to get sued into oblivion by a photographer with a stick up his butt. Yoshihisa Tomobechi, the man responsible for most of this soundtrack, actually is a jazz saxophonist with a number of released albums of synthy soundscapes and his improvisational sax playing layered on top. He clearly has an interest in the intersection of acoustic jazz and synthesized sound, and his music is worth checking out if that kind of thing sounds interesting to you. Thank you so much for watching my deep dive on an incredibly deep cut game. You can support what I do on my Patreon, where $5 supporters get access to all of my transcriptions of video game music, including both the Super Nintendo and live versions of just about this whole soundtrack. I'll see you all in the next one.